I'm Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Clean up your damn room. Stand up straight with your shoulders back and listen to The Patrick Coffin Show.
Welcome to episode 4 of a 4-episode series on the phenomenon of transgenderism. We started with my good friend Walt Heyer, former transgender person. That was in episode 1. And then we spoke with Hudson Biblo, former not technically transgender, gender confused, cross-dressing, same-sex attraction. And Hudson's story resonates with a lot of people who are confused about what the difference between a man and a woman is, and how Christian faith was a huge light shedder for Hudson. And then this past week, Dr. Michelle Cretella, president of the American College of Pediatricians, on how trans activism and that ideology has infiltrated pediatrics. Today, we speak with Dr. Ryan Anderson, who has written not just a book, but the book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. That's coming up straight ahead, right here on The Patrick Coffin Show. Yes, indeed. Welcome back. We're so glad to be joined by Dr. Ryan Anderson. He's the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and the author of Truth Overruled and What is Marriage, Man and Woman, a Defense, co-authored with Robbie George and Sharif Girgis. He's appeared on all the major television outlets, and his works appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Anderson's research has been cited by 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices in Supreme Court cases. And his latest book just covers the whole waterfront. It's called When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. I have a link at patrickcoffin.media. Without further ado, Ryan Anderson, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me. Happy to be with you.
Congrats on the success of the book. You just keep cranking out these rich, detail-oriented, they're not policy wonk books, but it's not like, writing a People magazine article. So congratulations.
No. Thank you. Yeah. Trying to stay out of trouble and keep myself busy.
Well, I see you a lot on, not just on television, but in tape debates and so on. You're very willing to get yourself into uncomfortable scenarios where your opponent disagrees with you and half the audience or more disagrees with you. Is this something that you find to be worth it? Because I'm sure people look at you, your friends say, Ryan, you don't have to keep pounding your head with a nail on it. You can stop doing that. In other words, what's the net gain?
Sure. So the net gain here is that in any one of these audiences, there are going to be people who, in their gut, know that what the mainstream media is telling them isn't quite right, and that what I'm saying has the ring of truth to it. And so it's important, especially when I'm speaking on college campuses or at law schools, is precisely to be able to reach out to those students, to let them know that they're not crazy, they're not alone, that there's serious research and good arguments that supports what they in their gut might be inclined to believe is true. But then there are also students who don't know the truth yet and can be persuaded of it. There's no reason why we should assume that just because someone has preliminarily made up their mind on these issues that they're a lost cause or that they can't be persuaded out of it. So they're not going to hear the truth from any of their professors because almost all of these college campuses are universally, monolithically on the political left side of the spectrum. Important for someone like me to show up and to present my case.
Well, you do it with charity. I mean, I've watched people practically yelling at you, and it's like water off your back. You want to stick to the facts. Why is it important to not lose your cool and just stick to the research and the data and the science and this is important too, as you bring out in the book, the experience of people who retransition, who bitterly regret it, like our mutual friend Walt Heyer. Those people's voices are not heard, the people who regret it and who've suffered terribly from that decision.
So, a couple of thoughts. One is that it's important not to lose your cool because to a certain extent, I want to model how I want people listening to me or watching me to behave. It's almost like not only hear what I'm saying, but hear how I'm saying it, because that's how I want you to say it. If you're going to be having conversations with your family, with your friend, with colleagues at work, with classmates at school, I don't want you losing your cool. I don't want you being belittling or engaging in name calling or stigmatizing people. I want you speaking appropriately, and that means I have to speak appropriately.
Right.
Another factor here is that losing your cool, that's not effective. It doesn't persuade people.
It doesn't have an impressive track record of convincing the other side.
bomb throwing typically is good, kind of throwing red meat at your audience. It's not particularly good at persuading people who are sitting on the fence or making people on the other side of the fence reconsider their position. So we have to be able to speak a language that other people can find accessible. And for me, this just comes naturally because of my own educational experience. I spent 12 years at a very liberal Quaker school. I then spent 4 years at Princeton. I'm used to being the odd duck in the room from kind of a philosophical or political perspective. And so I'm just used to talking to people who don't agree with me.
Mm-hmm. At what age does the new, what's the word, the new conscientization, the new propagandization about this, where the new normal is that transgenderism is not just a thing now suddenly, and we'll talk about how quickly we've got to where we are, but it's a thing to be promoted and celebrated and never challenged. It seems to me that this is moving from, you said dealing with students and professors. Well, it's now high school, middle school. Is it, how early does this stuff get into, say, the public school systems as a premise? It's
kindergarten and grade school. I think about in the book, I use the graphic, the genderbread person and the gender unicorn. Those are graphics. These are images that are being used in grade schools to catechize children on how to think about their own gender identity, their own sexual orientation, their own self-image. And it's, the graphics are colorful, they're bright, they're attractive, precisely to be appealing to young students. And I describe it as catechism because rather than catechizing children according to the Baltimore Catechism or the Westminster Catechism, there's a new catechism. It's the gender unicorn, which is telling people that sex is merely assigned at birth and their gender identity is something that's merely a self-creation between their ears.
Assigned at birth. That's a new maxim, isn't it? Almost bordering on mantra. Why is it not true?
So, I mean, what's interesting is if you say, it's a new maxim, it's so new that the genderbread person got in trouble because the genderbread person said biological sex. So, one of the cutting edge tools to indoctrinate kids is already outdated because it used the wrong nomenclature, because it acknowledges that there is biological sex. Why isn't it true, to answer your question there? No one assigns our sex to us. Our sex is something that we are conceived into. We're conceived as either male or female. This starts with our DNA and our chromosomes. This influences our embryonic development in terms of what reproductive organs are produced, what sex hormones are produced, how those reproductive organs and sex hormones then influence the rest of the development of our bodies. All of this is taking place in utero. And so when we are born, a doctor doesn't assign a sex to us. Frequently, 20 weeks earlier, an ultrasound technician recognized our bodily sex, a bodily reality, not something that was assigned, and as a result, not something that can be reassigned. And so you can see why they wanted to use the new nomenclature of sex assigned at birth, because that would then make it seem more plausible that sex can be reassigned.
There's always someone who's going to be offended by something. You note in the book that on the page where you're contrasting the gingerbread person to the unicorn figure, the gingerbread person looks kind of mannish. Wasn't sufficient. It just becomes a really confusing word salad. I mean,
and that's why
to complain about the design of the cartoon.
And historically, the term was a genderbread man. Right? And so everyone was like, wait, this or a gingerbread.
Yeah, right, gingerbread man, that's right. Man. Yeah. And
when they created the genderbread person, the complaint from some activists was that it looks too much like a man.
Right.
And the second complaint was that the nomenclature, it said biological sex, and now the up-to-date terminology is sex assigned at birth.
Mm-hmm. Even though birth itself is arbitrary.
Why is it assigned there?
Yeah.
Why not sex assigned at ultrasound? I mean, one of the points I make in the book is that the claims of the activist are constantly being updated. And today's enlightenment will be tomorrow's outdated bigotry, even for the activists. And so I even show some of the LGBT activist groups originally didn't include the T. And so their acronym is outdated. And so they no longer go the acronym no longer stands for anything because it had left out transgender people. It just shows you how quickly this movement has progressed.
Well, let me press pause there, because this is confusing to me. Because we're hectored or told frequently by the activists who get themselves on mainstream media outlets that transgendered as a phenomenon is distinct from intersex, which is distinct again from homosexuality. So how did the T get attached to the LGB part?
For political reasons. I mean, to a certain extent, what happened here was you had groups of people who felt socially ostracized and politically had a common cause, and so they came together. But this also shows you how thoughtless so many of our political and cultural leaders have been on this issue, because they assume that because they were in favor of gay rights, because they were in favor of gay marriage, once the Supreme Court had redefined marriage, that they just immediately moved from the LGB to the T without ever really considering what was at stake. And so I think many of these political and cultural leaders, if they really stop to think that their support now for LGBT rights means they're placing a 10-year-old boy on puberty-blocking drugs, or they're placing a 15-year-old girl on testosterone, that they might say, wait, we need to actually slow down and reconsider what we're doing. They wouldn't just kind of uncritically accept it as the next frontier of the civil rights movement. More is at stake here.
Well, they've brilliantly likened the trans movement to skin color, as with the gay rights movement as well. And obviously, no shortage of African Americans are not happy with that analogy, since one has to do with skin color and the other has to do with sexual behavior. And so it just becomes one more effort to couch it in terms of human rights and civil rights. And therefore, if I decline to use one of the how many new pronouns are there? I mean, I think
Facebook has 56, if I remember correctly.
Well, I've talked to Dr. Jordan Peterson about this. This is our very first interview back 14 months ago, before all this hit the fan up in Canada with the passage of Bill C-17. And it's troubling that speech has become forced, and it's almost that into the era or the sphere of thought. Some thoughts are not correct. There's the fact that you and I are having this conversation is still legal. I'm sure some people watching, or if this gets shared somewhere, they'll be angry that we're assuming that there are only two sexes, and that sex and gender really ought not to have been separated. So this leads me to ask you a question about Title IX and 1972 kind of controlling document and how that's shifted. What is Title IX for people who've never heard of this, and why did the Obama administration's changing of the linguistics change the debate?
Sure. So, I mean, Title IX is a law passed back in 72 that guaranteed equality between the two sexes in education. It says you can't discriminate in any federally funded education program, which means all public schools and virtually all private four-year colleges. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex. But then Title IX made it clear, both in the title itself and in its implementing regulations, that separate facilities for men and women wasn't discrimination on the basis of sex. So you need to have equal facilities for men and women, but you don't need to have them be commingled. You can have separate bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, dorm rooms, but you have to provide women with the same quality of bathroom, locker room, sports team, and dorm room as you do for men.
Yeah.
You can't have like economics for the boys in the class and home economics for the girls. They both need to have equal opportunities. The Obama administration, in its last year in office, redefined the word sex to be gender identity. And then it issued what's known as a Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education that went to all of the public schools and all of the four-year colleges, with the exception of about 4 or 5, saying you have to now redo your bathroom policy, your locker room policy, your sports team policy, your dorm room, hotel room. Anytime when you had been making a policy based on biological sex, you now have to do that policy based on gender identity. Thankfully, a judge struck this down. And thankfully, the Trump administration reversed course when it came into office. If I have time to add one thing, you had mentioned before that question, you said that some people might be upset that we're assuming there are two sexes. it's not an assumption at all.
Yeah, that's how they would couch it.
From their perspective, sure. But I mean, from reality, the reason that we're saying there are two sexes is because there are two sexes. The sex of an individual is determined by that organism's organization with respect to sexual reproduction. And across the animal kingdom, so not just in human beings, but across the animal kingdom, there are two complementary ways in which bodies can be organized with respect to sexual reproductive. There's a male sexual reproductive system and a female sexual reproductive system. They're male sex chromosomes, female sex chromosome, male hormones, female hormones. And so the way that biologists identify the sexes, the reason we have men and women, males and females, is based upon how our body is organized. And so you can see this starting with the chromosomes, the DNA, then the internal reproductive organs, the external genitalia, the sex hormones, the secondary sex characteristics. That's not an assumption, and it's not arbitrary. It's not merely assigned.
Yeah.
It's our bodily reality.
And the two bodily realities, the male and the female, are mutually independent, and you cannot have that two in one flesh unless both are communing, and hence, from that we get the miracle of birth.
And to a certain extent, you don't have the concept of male without the concept of female. The way in which we're a sexually dimorphic species is precisely because the male sexual reproductive system and the female sexual reproductive system only are fully intelligible in union with each other. Unlike the respiratory system and the circulatory system, where we're each complete as an individual, with respect to the reproductive systems, it actually takes a male and female united as one flesh to complete that reproductive act and that reproductive purpose.
Do you believe it's, pardon me, literally impossible to change genders?
Well, I mean, so you say genders there. It's literally impossible to change sexes. So you're at the physical level. I can't be a female. There's nothing modern science, modern medicine can do to change the way that my body is organized to actually make me a female. What they can do, though, is they can feminize my body. So depending on what you mean by changing genders, I could take estrogen to feminize my body. I could have surgery to change my jaw structure, to change the size of my Adam's apple. I could have surgery to remove my male reproductive organs, external genitalia. I could have cosmetic surgery to have breast implants, to have various reconstructive surgery. I can wear dresses, present myself as a woman. So if that's what you mean by changing genders, then yes, it's possible to present yourself as if the opposite sex. But it's not possible at a physical or metaphysical level to actually change sexes. So sex reassignment surgery, it fails as a physical matter because you can't actually reassign sex.
I want to hit how quickly all this has kind of galloped upon us. I don't imagine your book would have been imaginable as anything needed 10 years ago. The first time I ever, apart from, Some Like It Hot and who's the guy, Milton Berle would dress up in drag and burlesque. It was a big laugh. Oh, look, he's dressed up like a woman. But then certain films began to treat transgenderism with no bit of irony. The first one I can think of is The Crying Game, the Neil Jordan film, and then Big Boys Don't Cry, which was Hilary Swank's big breakout film. And you line up some of the examples of how this has become mainstream in your book. You've got the Bruce Jenner to Caitlyn, I Am Kate.
Right.
I think Call Me Kate was the failed TV show. Then you had Chaz Bono, who was on Dancing with Stars for a season or two. Transparent on Amazon. Orange is the New Black. You had a trans character, also the actor, actress. I wish we could just go back to actor and actress. That's just me. I Am Jazz. And then Tom Hooper made a film called The Danish Girl, starring Eddie Redmayne. National Geographic have a documentary called Gender Revolution. And of course, Brendan/Chelsea Manning. It just seems like a wall of new examples and dramatic depictions and a kind of a mainstream effort to normalize this and to make it a taboo for anyone to say, okay, stop for a second. You can't literally change your sex. Sex change is impossible. Sex is not assigned at birth. All the things that we're saying now are now more and more, revolutionary acts.
Right.
The speed of it, Ryan. The speed that brought us to here.
And it wasn't always this way, because I opened the book by recounting the story of what took place at Johns Hopkins Hospital back in the 70s. Because in the 1960s, if I remember correctly, it was 1965, Hopkins pioneered sex reassignment procedures, and they opened their sex reassignment clinic. And then in 1979, it was shut down. And what had taken place in between was Dr. Paul McHugh had arrived at Hopkins. He was named psychiatrist in chief. He asked one of his colleagues to conduct a study on what the long-term outcomes were for the patients who had sex reassignment procedures at Hopkins. And the outcomes weren't pretty. While they were happy with the surgery as a cosmetic matter, as a technical matter, none of their underlying kind of social struggles showed signs of significant improvement. And so McHugh said, we have people coming to us struggling with their identity, struggling with their place in the world, and we're trying to address it by changing their bodies rather than by helping them feel comfortable in their bodies. And so that clinic at Hopkins remained shut down for 40 years. It only opened up again a year and a half ago under pressure from activists. So to answer your question of how has this all happened so quickly, is that it went from something where people struggling with their gender identity, people who have gender dysphoria, were viewed as, what can we do to help alleviate this struggle, alleviate this suffering? How can we help people feel comfortable in their actual bodies? To politicized movement of how can we transform the body to align the body with someone's thoughts and feelings. And in the past decade, 45 pediatric gender clinics have opened. A decade ago, there were none. It's 2007 when Boston Children's Hospital became the first major hospital to open one of these clinics. And now there are over 45 clinics. And this is where parents are being told that you have to give your child puberty-blocking drugs, you have to give your daughter testosterone, your son estrogen, or else your child might commit suicide. And when faced with a dilemma like that, so many parents just don't know what to do.
Well, the claim that they'll commit suicide unless you go along to get along and have them change their bodily structure to fit the powerful the impulse that says, look, I am the opposite sex. That claim of suicide is ironic in light of the actual suicide rate for people who go through the mutilation. The mutilations, I was going to call it a ceremony, operation. Tell us about the Gothenburg and Karolinska studies from Sweden, because this I think this proves several things. One of them is you can't say that the surrounding society was transphobic or homophobic or ultra conservative. So what do those studies verify? Why are important?
So sure. I mean, in the book I highlight two things that are really important. One is that almost all of the literature reviews, so all of the people who have looked at all of the existing literature on this, a 2004 study that the UK paper The Guardian commissioned at Birmingham University, a 2014 literature review from Hayes Incorporation, a 2016 literature review from Dr. McHugh and Dr. Mayer, 2016 literature review from the Obama administration, Center for Medicaid and Medicare. They all show that the existing studies are either low or very low quality. And even of those studies, there are none that show conclusively that sex reassignment actually benefits their patients in the long run in terms of the psychometric outcomes for quality of life. So point one is that there's no rigorous science that shows this actually benefits, improves quality of life for the patients who undergo it. Point two is that many of those struggles persist. And as a result, we know that 41% of people who identify as transgender attempt suicide at some point in their lives. And people who have had sex reassignment surgery are 19 times more likely than the general population to die by suicide. So we have people who are struggling in life. The therapy they're receiving, sex reassignment procedures, aren't adequately addressing those struggles. We can't say whether or not they're causing the poor outcomes because the studies are low and very low quality, so they don't actually control for causality. But these therapies aren't providing the desired outcome because these people, they want to feel whole, they want to feel happy.
Right.
And while some of them do, on an individual basis, you can find anecdotes of people who have had improved quality of life. There's no actual scientific evidence that, in general, this is the outcome.
Was it the Karolinska study in Sweden that found that people who've gone through the gender reassignment surgery have a suicide rate which jumps up 20 times higher than the general population? Am I getting that right?
If that's Karolinska, if that's the Jenné study, but it is this. It's known as the Swedish study, and I can't remember right now which author is that one in particular.
What
but
happened?
I think it's 19 times greater outcome likelihood of death by suicide, which is just tragic because no one wants to see those sorts of outcomes on either side of this debate.
Sure.
I mean, no one's engaging in this with bad intentions.
Well, this is why the conversation has to be conducted with great compassion and humanity, because this is something that has nothing to do with politics whatsoever. It transcends both sides of the aisle. It transcends which newspapers you read. We're talking about human suffering and how to best alleviate it. You were talking earlier, Ryan, about how the acronyms keep changing, and what has begun to be a politically correct bromide next week becomes another outrage and an example of bigotry. Some people, no matter how sympathetic they are to the political aims of many of the trans activists, and no matter how otherwise they see the world from a moral or political point of view, they can still step in it badly and be shamed and run out of town on a rail. I'm thinking of Dr. Ken Zucker up in Toronto. What was Dr. Zucker's fate? Why did he run afoul with the establishment, with big trans, if you will?
And this is what's so remarkable here is that Dr. Zucker, he was the editor of the Journal of Homosexuality for a number of years. He was probably the leading expert on gender dysphoria in children. He helped lead the team that wrote the section on gender dysphoria for children in the DSM-5. And he was in favor of transitioning for some adults. He thought for some adults with gender dysphoria, the best we could hope for was for them to transition and live as if the opposite sex. He didn't think that was a particularly good therapy for children. His clinical experience and what the scientific literature reveal is that 80 to 95% of children naturally will grow out of it if they're given the time and the space to do so. And so his recommended therapeutic approach for children was simply to engage in talk therapy. Sit down with the child and ask them, why do you think you're a boy trapped in a girl's body? What is it about your fears of being a girl, or your anticipations, your expectations, the appeal of being a boy? Find out what makes them uncomfortable with their own sexual identity, and what is it about the opposite sex that they find attractive. And try to address those anxieties, those attractions, help them to see that they can have everything they're looking for while identifying with their body, and just talk through it. And so as a result, there was protests leveled against him. There were activist groups calling for his sacking. And then eventually there was this entire sham procedure in which they wrote a report on his clinic full of errors. But then the local government, I don't think it's actually the Canadian national government, I believe it was the provincial government, shut down his clinic. And the most frequently cited source for this part of the book is New York Magazine. New York Magazine. This is not a right-wing...
that bastion of Genghis Khan readers.
Yeah. This is a progressive magazine in Manhattan. Their science reporter was reporting on what was going on with Dr. Zucker in Toronto. And he was saying, look, this is a sham. This is a show trial that's taking place. And unfortunately, as far as I know, still today, Dr. Zucker has not been reinstated to his clinic, which is a real shame because the parents were very, very happy with the care that their children received. Dr. Zucker and his colleagues were able to help children who were struggling with their gender identities feel comfortable in their own bodies. And that's a very valuable service.
It sounds like another example of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Let's just wait. This stat you just cited is stunning. Upwards of 90% of children with gender dysphoria, it works itself out. They get through the blues or the dark ages known as puberty, and they come out on the other side, no longer wanting to be the opposite sex. That's I wonder how many people even know that's the case.
That stat is frequently attacked by activists on the left who don't like its existence and want to dispute it. And again, I cite a piece from that same writer at New York Magazine saying more or less every reasonable physician researcher in this area acknowledges that these desistance rates, and that's what the term is, you desist from your transgender identity rather than persist in it, that they're real. That a very large majority of children will naturally just grow out of it and re-identify with their bodies.
Mm-hmm. With same-sex attraction, there are several classic textbook causal factors. I mean, the Catechism of the Catholic Church does mention it, but it's mysterious. I don't think there's any one magic bullet. Human beings are complex, and it's a fallen world, and there's no way you can find out one strain of causal sources that explains everything. But there are some things, like the classic bad relationship with the same-sex parent, or an abusive relationship with the father in the case of a boy. Are there similar family backgrounds that predispose one to gender dysphoria? Does it have anything to do with the divorce culture? Is it something purely genetic? What is it? Heritable? What?
No one knows. The research on this, I mean, and this is just the reality about gender identity in general, how we come to develop and solidify and consolidate our gender identity. And it's even more true when it comes to a gender identity conflict, when it comes to a transgender gender identity. The researchers, if they're being honest, will admit they have no idea what the developmental mechanisms look like, how this comes about. They do have some clinical observations, and they can observe that there are greater likelihood of the occurrence of gender dysphoria in children with autism, greater likelihood when there's been certain types of trauma or abuse. Mm-hmm. But they don't know with any great rigor, and certainly with no scientific precision, partly because the research into gender dysphoria and gender identity conflicts is so new, and partly because the studies have been so poorly designed historically. So what I would caution is great humility and caution as we approach these things, because there's so much that researchers don't know, mm-hmm. which suggests that we shouldn't be rushing to mainstream transgender identities, and we shouldn't be rushing to be encouraging children to transition, and we certainly shouldn't be using very strong drugs on their bodies that'll be blocking their development and locking in mm-hmm. identities.
And it creates a bunch of unintended side effects. One of them has been in the news recently, where a biological male identifies as female, goes through the operation, and then becomes an athlete, whether an MFA, fighter or wrestler, where you have these huge lopsided victories because they're giving either an unfair anthropological advantage because they're actually young men, or they're women who've been pumped so full of testosterone and androgen that a regular girl can't compete.
Right, and we've seen two examples of this recently at the high school level. One was just a week or two ago in Texas, where mm-hmm. a high school girl who's transitioning to live as a boy and has been taking testosterone for 2 years now. For 2 years in a row, this girl has won the state girls wrestling championship.
Well, duh.
And it's not surprising that a girl taking testosterone supplements would be able to beat all of the girls not taking testosterone supplements. Mm-hmm. In Alaska, last year during the track championships, a boy who identifies as a girl won one of those state track championships. And so you can have the problem actually in both directions. If you're allowed to compete as the opposite sex, it can be unsafe for you. It might be unsafe for the people you're competing against. It might just be unfair. And if you compete against people of your same sex while you're taking male hormones, mm-hmm. unfair. It can be unfair and in some cases unsafe.
And how about people taking advantage of things like bathroom laws? You cite in the book When Harry Became Sally predators just gaining access to young girls and their mothers changing just because they can, whether or not they're actually transgendered or not.
And this is something that's really important to distinguish. What are the concerns when it comes to these transgender policies? Because in the book, I'm very careful to say the privacy concern, let's say in a locker room, is that a high school boy who identifies as a girl hasn't had any of the surgery. The girls in that locker room, they don't want to see him in a state of undress.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be seen by him when they're in a state of undress. It's understandable, the privacy concern. The safety concern, it's not primarily that people who identify as transgender will be committing sex crimes. It's that perverts will abuse these laws to commit sex crimes. So a pervert, whether identified as cisgender or transgender, if the new rule at Target is that anyone can use any fitting room just based upon their sheer say-so of their, quote, gender identity, men can simply put on a dress, go to the women's fitting room, and then film people under the fitting room stall door with their iPhones. And several men have already been caught doing this. And I document this in the book precisely to show that there's a reason why we created separate facilities for males and females in the first place. Not because of our gender identity, but because of our biology.
Sure.
The reason we have separate facilities is based on bodily differences.
Target certainly took a bath in their very poor handling of that controversy, and I love that they deny that it has anything to do with the bathroom controversy. You have a graph showing how much money has bled out of that company.
And it's right from the Wall Street Journal, right? So I took it from like the financial newspaper of record, showing how their stock price has tanked, how their sales have declined. And they say, oh, it's because everyone's moving to online shopping. And yet Walmart was flourishing during this period. They're kind of like big box stores flourishing while Target, unfortunately, was not. And I think part of it has to do with parents didn't feel safe taking their kids to stores.
Another thing that transcends politics has to do with, well, parents, and I've got money to spend. I'm not going to spend it there if my child's going to be even perceived to be in any kind of threat or any kind of weird, creepy environment. Isn't it true, Ryan, that it's not just individuals who virtue signal? Corporations do as well. Take PayPal, for example. They've been on a soapbox, leaving out a few uncomfortable details about their corporate locations.
Oh, of course. So you look at PayPal. They wanted to boycott the state of North Carolina after North Carolina passed its bill protecting privacy and safety in public restrooms. But now I forget all the name of the countries, but they have like one of their corporate headquarters in a country that kills people if they engage in consensual same-sex acts.
Yeah, I think it's Indonesia.
Is it? I can't remember if it's Indonesia
so.
or the AUE.
The AUE, they have another. I think it's an outpost there. There are plans to go there. Well, yeah. Pick one.
They'll set up their international sites in countries that kill gay people, but they're going to threaten to boycott North Carolina simply because it wants to find a reasonable compromise to acknowledge the concerns of people who are transgender while also acknowledging the concerns of everyone else.
Well, Ryan, this is maybe a good time to turn, and because I could go a couple more hours on this. You're advocating reasonable compromises to fit the humanity of people who for whatever reason find themselves in living out this transgender moment. You are not for censorship. You are not for ridiculing people or wanting to segment them or force them to go through any unjust discrimination. The other side, the real ideologues, they don't care about this, right? They're not really interested in finding common ground. They want to silence and they want to censor. But you're saying, look, is there a way we can come to reasonable compromises and set up policies that are rational, that involve give and take?
Of course. I mean, America's a free country, which means adults are going to be free to make their own decisions. I wrote this book to, at the very least, help adults make informed decisions. I want to urge great caution when it comes to children, because children shouldn't be making life-altering decisions when they're too young and immature to fully understand the consequences. And then when it comes to public policy issues on things like bathrooms, locker rooms, things like that, can we find a way to work out a compromise that would respect the interests of everyone? So I give an example of, I can understand why a high school boy who identifies as a girl doesn't want to be forced into the boys' bathroom. But at the same time, can other people understand why the girls don't want him to be allowed into their bathroom? So can we find a way of accommodating that student with the creation of like a single occupancy facility? And one of the schools that was sued by the Obama administration had done just that. They created 3 separate single occupancy facilities, one on each floor of the high school, so that a student who identifies as transgender and any other student who desires more privacy could use those facilities. And then they sued anyway, saying that unless you treat me exactly the same way as the gender identity that I claim, you're discriminating based on who I am.
Right.
That's the unreasonable side of some of the activists.
For a sense of proportion, what is the total estimated percentage of people in, let's say, the American population who identify as transgender?
Historically, it's been somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6. So roughly you could say half of a percentage.
Half of a percent.
Half of a percent. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they've had surgery or hormone. I mean, for some people who identify as transgender, it would just be dressing as the opposite sex. Some people would also have hormone therapy. Some people would also have surgical therapies. But what's most startling is that a study published in the journal Pediatrics just 2.5 weeks ago showed that for current high school students, 3% were identifying as transgender or other gender nonconforming identities, which suggests that cultures cultivate, and that a culture that is cultivating the idea that you can be trapped in the wrong body, the idea that you can be transgender, is producing more people who believe those ideas and who act on those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's a moment we're living through, or a season, or a chapter? How long is this story? Because a lot of toothpaste has left the tube, a lot of horses have left the barn. Pick your metaphor. Right. Is there a way to get back to the way we were? Let's say, it feels like 45 minutes ago, before right. The need for your book came out. Is there something that we'll wake up someday in the next not too distant future and say, what were we thinking? In other words, what has to happen? What data has to come in that's unambiguous to show the drive toward this mutilation surgery is not such a good idea? Maybe we should rethink the whole thing.
Right. So I think most Americans are already there. The divide that we see, it's not between left and right, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, religious, non-religious. The divide we see is between elite and ordinary Americans. The people who have bought into kind of the transgender worldview are the political and cultural elites. Mm-hmm. Ordinary Americans, whether they're left or right, religious or not, they don't want their 5-year-old boy coming home and saying, I'm a girl. They don't want their 15-year-old girl coming home and saying, there's a boy in my locker room.
Yeah.
And so what we need to do is simply to equip these people to understand the truth about what's going on. So that's what motivates me in this book, is how can I help people better understand what's going on so they can more effectively respond to it. It will be a moment, because from the perspective of history, we will one day look back and say, what were we thinking? The only question is, how long will this moment last? And that's going to be dependent on what you and I and all of our viewers right now do in response.
Well, Dr. Ryan Anderson, I'm grateful that you wrote the book, grateful that you carved out some time. It's called When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Woman. I've got some show notes at patrickcoffin.media. Subscribe, keep in touch. And Ryan, I'd love to have you back on, because I want to re-hit the redefinition of marriage, which happened under our noses, and no one seems to realize we can still talk about this. It's still a fundamental problem. And thanks for modeling your theory with the practice, which is charitable and balanced. And I always learn a lot talking to you. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?